Welcome to the Rock and Roll Show podcast. I'm your host, Alex Gadd, and this week we're going to try something new. I've got a top 10 list for you, and the subject of our first top 10 list is the top 10 first songs on the first album from an act. Now, why is this worth a discussion here on the podcast, you may ask? Because you only get one chance to make a first impression, and some acts were able to make a really incredible first impression right out of the record sleeve. Now, I find this topic endlessly interesting, and I think you will too. It all starts with how albums are sequenced. In the current climate where streaming services dominate music distribution, the way artists get paid is based on a concept called skip rate. A song has to be played for more than 30 seconds to trigger a payment. And so it makes sense for artists and record companies to front load their albums, which aren't really consumed as albums most of the time these days, but are really just playlists. So the best song, or the song that's perceived to be the best song, will be listed as track one. Then the next best song is track two, and so on, so that the listener won't skip over those first few tracks. Instead, hopefully settling in to keep listening. These days, you should expect that the first song on every album will be good, if not the best one on the album. But in the past, before streaming or even before the iTunes Store emerged in 2003, music was sold as albums, with only certain songs from each album being released as singles for separate purchase. Music was marketed primarily on the radio, then on the radio and MTV, where those singles were played. So when a consumer heard a song they liked, they went out and bought the whole album. And then they had already paid for all the songs on the album before they had heard most of them. So front loading an album with the best track wasn't always necessary and wasn't always done. Some artists saw their albums as a larger artistic statement, with the songs being sequenced based on how they work together to tell a larger story. Now, Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run's a perfect example of this. It was sequenced to tell a series of stories or vignettes that all happen in one day from morning until night in and around New York and New Jersey, where he's from. And in that sequence, the album's most famous song, the title track, Born to Run, is actually the fifth song on the album, though it is the first song on side two of the LP. Now, going to his first album, Greetings from Asbury Park, they put the best song up front first. Blinded by the Light was the single, and that gets back to the point of this episode. On an act's first album, putting the best track first makes sense anytime because it allows the act to make as good a first impression as possible in hopes that the listener will like that first song and give the rest of the album a good listen. So for this episode, I reviewed more than 200 first albums by significant artists of the 20th and early 21st century. And I only identified 40 that had first songs that were either the first or at worst the second best songs on that album, and were also released as singles because, again, that's how an act made a first impression. Then I whittled down the list to the 10 songs I felt were the strongest overall. I acknowledge this is just my opinion, and I'd certainly like to hear yours. So please let me know what you think in the comments. And if you would also hit like and subscribe or follow while you're down there, that would be greatly appreciated. Now let's get into it. The top 10 first songs on an act's first album. Coming in at number 10 is my favorite Nine Inch Nails song, Head Like a Hole, from their 1989 debut album Pretty Hate Machine. This song pushed industrial music to the forefront, at least for me, and really brought together rock and punk and even pop into the electronic music that had evolved slowly since the 1970s. Using all of those influences and building on the sounds of bands like Ministry and KMFDM, Nine Inch Nails forged new ground. Head Like a Hole was so aggressive, so cold sounding, and still really catchy all at once. I was really a straight ahead rock guy at the time, but my boundaries had been widening while I was at college. And this song and the accompanying video that played, at least in my memory, only late night on MTV at first, both caught my interest and freaked me out a little bit. Although it was the second single from the album, it was the first one that I heard, and then heard it again when I first put on the CD of Pretty Hate Machine in early 1990. Different from almost anything else I was listening to at the time, this was an immediate winner for me. And I recognized the transition that was happening from new wave music that had morphed into earlier industrial music to this, which really felt like something new. Using tension and release and grating metallic noise to amp up the anxiety in his music, Trent Reznor set the tone for his own soundtrack work just a few years later in movies like Seven, and certainly bands like The Prodigy and Marilyn Manson and hundreds of others took what Trent was doing and twisted it into their own takes on industrial music for better or for worse. But while Trent came up with other fantastic songs, none was as good for me as Head Like a Hole from Pretty Hate Machine. Number 9 is Mr. Tambourine Man by the Byrds. The Byrds were one of the first American bands to emerge in the wake of the initial wave of the British invasion, with a distinctive sound that merged folk, country, and the shimmering vocal harmonies of the Beach Boys into a new form that at first was called folk rock, but I kind of think of as more of the beginnings of country rock. For a short time, the Byrds were one of the biggest bands in the world at a time when most of the other biggest bands in the world were the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the Kinks. Pretty impressive company. Their first full length album was Mr. Tambourine Man, which was released in June of 1965. And the title track was a cover of a new Bob Dylan song that the band recorded in January of 1965, which was 2 months before Dylan even released his version of the song, and only 5 days after Dylan had recorded his version of his own song. They had heard a demo version in the fall of 1964 just as they were forming, and they rearranged it to be more pop or rock oriented, including the jangly Rickenbacker guitar sound that George Harrison and John Lennon had made popular in the Beatles only a year earlier. And of course, they had those incredible harmonies. Talk about creative juices flowing and new ideas evolving quickly. I always found that whole story fascinating of how the Byrds and Dylan hit with the same song at the same time. Now, the Byrds version went to number one on the Billboard and the UK singles charts. This song is the only cover song on this list, but as has happened with at least a few other Dylan songs, the cover version ends up being the more definitive version. And this was a case of that happening. Even Dylan himself endorsed the Byrds' take on this song, and Mr. Tambourine Man put another American rock band back into play at the top of the charts alongside the Beach Boys in 1965 among all the Brits. Number 8, Blitzkrieg Bop by the Ramones. The Ramones are generally considered the first true punk band. They played loud, loose, and extremely fast. They covered basically surf music and wrote original songs that sounded kind of dumb at first. But some of those songs were really commentaries on the disaffected youth of the 70s who felt left behind by society in the wake of the end of the hippie movement and the promise of the 60s falling flat. Now, the Ramones' first record was released in February of 1976 after the band spent more than a year and a half playing around the New York area, honing their act. Blitzkrieg Bop was the first single, also the first song from the first album. What an introduction. The band borrowed the idea of the Hey Ho introduction from the Bay City Rollers' Saturday, night, and a new sound was born. While no one in the mainstream noticed at first, the band went on to England in the summer to play some gigs, and things changed. They played a show in London at the Roundhouse, and then the next night, they played at a smaller club called Dingwalls, where both members of the Sex Pistols and the Clash were in attendance. The London punk scene that had been basically established by the Sex Pistols a year earlier exploded into the full blown subculture following those shows. And the Ramones came back to the States and lit the flames of the punk movements in LA and New York as well. And Blitzkrieg Bop was the introduction to it all. Hey ho, let's go. Number 7 is Our Lips Are Sealed by the Go-Go's. In 1981, the Go-Go's sprung into the pop culture with their debut album Beauty and the Beat. And the lead single, also the first track on the album, was Our Lips Are Sealed. They had come out of the LA punk scene that the Ramones helped get growing just 5 years earlier, but they played music that was somewhere between new wave and pop. The impact of the song was immediate and put the band on the map. The song went to number 20 in the Hot 100 singles chart. More importantly, it stayed on the chart for 30 weeks, which was a long time for a debut single. And it helped the album sit atop the US album chart for 6 straight weeks and sell more than 2 million copies. But what made this release and its lead single so important was that this was the first time in history that an all female band had achieved a number one record on which they had written and performed their own original music in the more than 36 years of the Billboard 200 album chart up to that point. They were breaking barriers, and Our Lips Were Sealed and its follow up single, We Got the Beat, broke down a barrier that was long overdue, paving the way for other female musicians to be taken seriously and given opportunities similar to, if not the same as, their male counterparts. This was a huge step in the right direction for popular music, which started with the ladies of the Go-Go's promising to stay quiet, which was an irony not lost on me as a 12-year-old. Number 6 on our list, Break On Through to the Other Side by The Doors. In 1966, California music was a mix of the Beach Boys and the Byrds, who had now established their folk rock vibe, and early psychedelia that was happening primarily up in the Bay Area as the Jefferson Airplane had released their first album and Grateful Dead was just getting going. In LA, the Doors were in residence on the Sunset Strip, developing their act, and after signing with Elektra Records, recorded their first self titled album at the end of 1966, releasing it in January of 67. The first song on side one was Prophetic. Break On Through to the Other Side was the first single from the record, and while it didn't really make any impact on the charts in the US, in fact, it performed better in the UK, reaching number 64 there versus never cracking the top 100 in America. It set the tone for this band and their next single, Light My Fire, to go to number one in the US. The album got as high as number two on the Billboard 200 album chart and sold more than 8 million copies ultimately. And it was Break On Through as much as anything that established the sound of the Doors, which brought a different, darker, more aggressive and ominous sound from California just as the Summer of Love was about to get started. Maybe they knew something. The Doors sound, which without a bass player used keyboards and guitars to produce swirling psychedelic music over which Jim Morrison's deep baritone voice delivered lyrics that were at times direct and confrontational, and other times were more mystical and confusing and poetic. And it's credited by various scholars as the spawning of the Gothic rock sound. The six albums the Doors recorded in just 5 years established them as one of the most influential bands of all time. Number 5 is Good Times, Bad Times by Led Zeppelin from Led Zeppelin 1. Now, Led Zeppelin is generally considered one of the greatest bands in the history of rock and roll. While they never had a hit single, they became one of the biggest selling and most influential bands ever, taking the sound that Cream had brought to the forefront, that heavy blues that helped provide the foundation for heavy metal in the 70s, and blowing it open. Zeppelin then spent 10 years perfecting that sound, and they emerged seemingly full formed on their first album, from which they only released one single. That's right, the lead track, Good Times, Bad Times. It was the only song on that first record that was credited to all four of the band members in writing it, and it served as the blueprint for the essential Zeppelin sound. Heavy bass and drums anchoring a basic blues song with blistering Jimmy Page guitar and Robert Plant's incredible voice. It was produced by Jimmy Page himself, and it sounded like a cover of an old blues song, which they did elsewhere, especially on the first two albums, where elsewhere they incorporated folk music, which would be a strong influence on their music as well. It was the heavy blues that was their bread and butter, and Good Times, Bad Times was the template from that, right from the jump. At number 4 is Surfing Safari, the title track from the Beach Boys' first long playing record. Now, the Beach Boys were really the first big band producing complete albums of original music and popular music in the 60s. They had done that in the mid 50s, but by 1962, singles ruled the chart, and the airwaves were largely filled with interpreters, singers who sang other people's songs. From Pat Boone to Frank Sinatra to the girl groups of Phil Spector and Motown, singers were singing songs written by songwriters and produced by producers, and the albums were just collections of singles released when there were enough singles to by an artist to put together a whole album. There were a few other original singer songwriters emerging at the same time. To be fair, Otis Redding's career was just getting going with his first hit, the incredible These Arms of Mine. Smokey Robinson was at Motown and he had just released Shop Around with the Miracles, which, again, amazing. And the Four Seasons were just getting started with songs like Sherry and Big Girls Don't Cry. But the 50 stars who wrote and performed their own music, exemplified by Chuck Berry and James Brown, had faded into the background after their initial successes and wouldn't have big hits again for a few more years. And Elvis, who was much more an interpreter than a singer songwriter, had taken a break from music to focus on his acting career after he got out of the army. In the 60s, he was mostly an actor and only sang in movies. So the pop music landscape was fairly open, with hits coming from songwriters and producers more than it was from musical acts. At the same time, there was another successful musical style happening, which was surf music. Surf music started as instrumental music fueled by the ripping songs of Dick Dale and the Deltones, the Surfaris, the Bel Airs, and the Chantays. Leo Fender, the founder of Fender Guitars, was working with some of these acts to fine tune the development of his equipment, his amplifiers and guitars. And there's a great book chronicling all of this. It's called The Birth of Loud. It's written by Ian Port about how both Fender and Gibson guitars companies started and developed alongside one another. I encourage you to check it out. Great book. But then the Beach Boys arrived on the scene with their first album, Surfin' Safari. The title track was the first one released, and it went to number 14 on the Hot 100 charts, and it sold all over the country. The biggest place it sold was New York City, where there was no surfing going on in 1962, I'm sure. Again, it set the template for the initial stage of what the Beach Boys' career would sound like, singing about surfing and sun with those incredible harmonies that were quintessential Beach Boys. Basically, selling the idea of surfing as the ultimate summer excitement and that there was an entire lifestyle out in California that the rest of the country should aspire to. And other countries as well. It went to number 20 in the US, but Surfing Safari was number one in Sweden. Amazing. Anyway, the opening line says it all. Let's go surfing now. Everybody's learning how. Come on safari with me. Okay, we're down to the top three, and you've heard me talk about this song before. It's Running with the Devil from Van Halen's debut album in 1978. As I recounted in a previous episode of this podcast, I am a huge Van Halen fan. And my love of the band really started when I discovered their debut album a full 4 years after it had been released. I heard their hit song Unchained in 1982 thanks to MTV, had my mind blown, and then quickly worked my way back through their previous three albums to find Van Halen 1 released again in 1978. The first side of that album is incredible, and it all starts with the opening track, Running with the Devil. It has a menacing opening, the slowly descending car horns leading into the sinister sounding bass, followed by the hi-hats and then a piano note run. Finally, the drums and the guitars kick in, and off we go on one of the best sides of music in the whole LP era. The song is about how life in a young, hardworking band is challenging, but it makes that life sound so damn cool. Interestingly, the song doesn't include any of Eddie Van Halen's signature tapping, which he saved for the next track on the record, Eruption. But Eddie's guitar sound is so fantastic. David Lee Roth sounds like he's having so much fun. Alex Van Halen's drums sound huge, and that's all already in place, as are the signature backing vocals pairing Eddie and bassist Michael Anthony. Everything's there, all their signature sounds, which would be staples of Van Halen music across all 6 albums that they recorded together. In my opinion, this one song, Running with the Devil, is one of the greatest intro songs in rock history, and it helped the album crack the top 20 on the Billboard chart. To do better than Running with the Devil, you have to have an absolutely incredible song. So let's find out which 2 songs are better than that. Number 2 is Purple Haze from the Jimi Hendrix Experience's opening album, Are You Experienced? The Jimi Hendrix Experience exploded onto the music scene in 1967. Though he was American, he was working out of London, and his band, The Experience, was made up of 2 Brits, bassist Noel Redding and drummer Mitch Mitchell. The sounds on this album were so revolutionary, so new and different, that it defied being categorized. Was it psychedelic, hard blues a la Cream, or something entirely unique? And the answer to all those is yes. Now, it's a bit of a cheat to put Purple Haze on this list because Purple Haze was not on the original UK release of the album at all. But it was recorded during the sessions for that album. And it was released as a single 2 months prior to the album's release and went to number 3 in the UK while the album hadn't even been out yet. By the time the album was released in the US in that August, it was included as track 1 on side 1 because it was a huge hit due to the enormity of the impact that this song and album had already had on the popular culture. Jimmy had just played the Monterey Pop Festival in June of 67, heralding the beginning of the Summer of Love that hit its apex with Woodstock 2 months later, where he closed out that festival. And this song was everywhere. It's been among the top songs on lists of the greatest guitar songs in history and the greatest songs in history. What a way to introduce yourself to the public. Incredible. And now the number 1 song on our list. It's hard to imagine how any song could top Purple Haze or Running with the Devil to make it to the top of this list, but then there's Guns N' Roses, who introduce themselves in the most Guns N' Roses way possible. Welcome to the Jungle. Welcome to the Jungle, as well as the whole Appetite for Destruction record, was a whirlwind that slapped the LA music scene in the face and the music buying public overall to wake us up from that hair metal that had dominated the charts up to that point in the 80s. From 82 or so through 1987, bands like Motley Crue, Quiet Riot, Def Leppard, Rat, Bon Jovi, and others dominated the charts, playing a glossy kind of glam metal. Slickly produced, polished songs about partying and guys dressed in spandex and hairspray, lusting after girls who were dressed basically the same way. The heavier, more aggressive bands in the 80s who still wore leather and jeans and were really angry were buried in the underground during this period. Bands like Metallica, Motorhead were toiling away, playing to a dedicated but much smaller audience. And then Axl Rose welcomed us to the jungle and everything changed. They exposed us to the dirty underbelly of Los Angeles and of the rock and roll lifestyle, accompanied by music that sounded edgy and dangerous, calling us to look at that other side of the glam image that we had been gleefully singing along to for the past few years. It was strangely very refreshing to hear music that grabbed you and forced you to listen, forced you to acknowledge things like heroin use and being broke and hustling to make it from day to day, all while still chasing the same dreams that the glam metal bands had been singing about. Welcome to the jungle. Watch it bring you to your knees. What other band comes out with a song like this as their introduction to the world? No other band is the answer. And while Guns only released 4 albums of original music with their core lineup intact between 87 and 91, and that counts Use Your Illusion as 2 separate albums, they're one of the most influential bands in history. And their first album is one of the best selling albums of all time, let alone a debut album. It sold approximately 30 million albums worldwide. You want to hear who else has sold that amount of records? Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, which was his 7th album. Pink Floyd's The Wall sold 30 million albums. It was their 11th album. And the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Abbey Road both sold 30 million albums. Soak that in for a minute. Only Meatloaf and Alanis Morissette have sold more debut albums than Guns N' Roses. And I would argue that while both of those records are great in their own way, neither one has had the lasting impact of Appetite for Destruction and Welcome to the Jungle, which remains the Gunners' signature song almost 40 years later. Well, that's my list. Remember, these are just my opinions. I might be wrong or have overlooked an obvious song that deserves to be on the list. Remember, I considered 40 songs. How do you think I did? I want to hear from you. What do you think I got right or wrong? Let me know in the comments and I'll try to respond to every one of them. And please like this video and subscribe or follow the podcast to make sure you get notified about each new episode. I have a reminder that we release a playlist for every new episode. Look for the Rock and Roll Show podcast playlist on Spotify every week, this week featuring the songs mentioned during this episode. So please check that out. The Rock and Roll Show podcast is a World Highway Media production. I'm your host, Alex Gadd, and until next time, remember that life is short, so get those concert tickets.